why, when I'm mixing color to get beautiful neutrals, my colors that I'm mixing look a lot uglier and don't have that beautiful mud quality of yours, Angela. I'm celebrating World Watercolor Month with a new video every day in July. Recently, I was teaching a workshop on Vancouver Island, and one of the questions that was asked during the workshop was to do with the subject of muddy color. Why, when I'm mixing color to get beautiful neutrals, my colors that I'm mixing look a lot uglier and don't have that beautiful mud quality of yours, Angela. Well, let's take a look. I think this is a really interesting question to tackle because we all often have the grass is greener, or maybe the grass is muddier on the other side of the fence. This idea that the colors I'm mixing just don't have the same zing as yours. I feel like I'm doing everything you're doing, and yet it's just not working. So let's take a look. First of all, let's just talk a little bit about how we get our muddy neutrals. I love keeping my palette a little bit dirty. So I have in my mixing wells, right now it's predominantly green and blue, but in these mixing wells, I don't clean them almost ever, because this is a really good place to get some really gorgeous kind of muddy-ish neutrals. So I'm just gonna wake up the paint here, swirl it around, and we'll just throw some of this down on the paper first of all. Okay, so this I like to call this palette dirt. I didn't coin the phrase, but I like it. And palette dirt gives you some really beautiful neutrals that you can play with in your paintings. These are neutrals that are made up of a bunch of other colors, and so over time they naturally get murky. And so it's a good place to start if you're looking for a nice neutral. This is kind of a greenish gray. Elsewhere in the palette, I've mostly got a little bit of a turquoisey green, and I've also got a lighter kind of spring green. It still has a little bit of a muddy quality to it if I'm comparing it to the pure colors in my palette. So right away we know that we get some really beautiful pure colors straight from the palette. Once we start mixing in these mixing wells, that's when we start to get some different murkier colors. If I wanted to take this green, for example, and start to make something a little bit more neutral, we start to mix complementary colors. So as we're mixing various colors into our palette wells, that's where our mud starts to come from, our neutrals. So I've added a little bit of orange. I think that's a burnt orange from Daniel Smith. I think it's burnt sienna. Quinacridone sienna, that sounds right. So just by adding a little bit of an orangey color to a bluish green, an orangey red to a bluish green, we're mixing in a complementary color, and that gives me a very beautiful kind of muted, muddy version of this, which was already a slightly muddy turquoise. So I can add complementary colors to my palette and start to get those beautiful neutrals. But if you're seeing a neutral that just doesn't look that pretty, there's a couple reasons that you might be struggling. And let's see if I can't replicate it. It's hard because I've been doing this for so long. And so you naturally want to make something pretty, and you develop strategies for making that work. One thing I want to point out is as I start to tilt that mixture towards orange, it's going to change that neutral. A little more orange. Let's go a little more. And so we get like a variety of different lovely neutrals that we can mix there. But what I often see people doing, and I think this is most of the time what's happening when you're getting muddy color that isn't pretty, doesn't look like this, is you're mixing your puddle of color here in the palette. And then you're putting it on the paper. Say you're painting a hill or a road or something along those lines. And then you're not resting, letting your paint rest at all. You're moving back and forth, and you're stirring that paint around and fussing with it while it is settling into the paper and drying. You're just going to keep manipulating that pigment. And what happens is, if you're a person that tends to fuss and manipulate your pigment, once it's on the paper, you're slowly, filling it in and smoothing it out and just working that paint over, is you're not just moving the pigment around and continuing to mix the pigment, but you're lifting, or you're tweaking this texture of the paper as well. And so you can get a kind of fussed over dullness to that wash just by how much you move back and forth over it once you've placed it on the page. Now, if I take instead that same color and I place my shape, I'm starting to run a little bit low, and I place my shape here, and I've got a little bit of shininess to the pigment. There's a little bit of maybe some flow there. What's going to happen is these two are going to dry differently. And I feel like maybe I should be messing with this more. I'm not going to. I'm going to just let it sit. The more you manipulate your paint on the paper, the less it's encouraged to do its own kind of settling into the page and being beautiful on its own. We can already see that this, as it's drying, is starting to get some really lovely variations that we're not seeing nearly so defined here. I'm going to try to show you that. Okay, so this is the stirred up version. And then over here, we have the one where I'm letting the color kind of settle on its own. Can you see that there's a little bit of a shift between the cool and the warm of the orange and the turquoise? There are areas that are getting very textural, especially over in here, where the cool and warm colors, the cool colors are kind of settling into the texture of the paper, because the fluidity of the paint and my willingness to let the paint do its own thing instead of stirring it around, that's letting that happen. Over here, we've got a lot of just a very flat feeling. It's very even. It's very smooth, really. But there's just a little beautiful transition of further kind of just a little more interesting, a little more textural, a little more variation between warm and cool within this shape. And that's just, it's as simple as that. It's how much messing about are you doing once that paint hits the paper. So with messing about being your enemy, and I can emphasize that and illustrate that just by looking over here at my palette, because as my palette is drying, you can see that the green and the orange are separating there as well. So you can see how much they want to separate. That's happening over on this side of the paper too. You can see there's a green in the corner and a blue to the left side. And when you notice your pigment doing this in the palette, these are the colors that you want to throw down on your paper and leave them alone. Don't spend a bunch of time blending them and stirring them around, because you will create a flatter effect than if you let it just settle into the page on its own. So that's the number one thing that I would suggest, is if you're mixing the same colors I am and getting, boring, ugly mud, that could just be the key that you need to breaking out of that kind of toxic trait. I don't know, that displeasing strategy. And it's just a good reminder that it's almost always better to let the paint do its thing, to give it space and trust it a little bit. I hope that was helpful for you. It's always just a good strategy to develop the ability to let your paint do its thing without too much panicking and trying to move it around once it hits the paper. There is a time and a place for drawing the paint across the page and encouraging it. But once that paint has been placed into a shape, I would much rather work around the edges to move it around than going back and forth inside of that shape. You'll get just a fresher look, less fussed over feeling. It's a really good way to avoid overworking your paintings. If you have any other questions, struggles that you're having with watercolor that you'd like to see me tackle in a future video, please do post in the comments. Give me as much detail as you can of what's going on, and I'll see if I can troubleshoot it for you. We can make a diagnosis and prescribe a course of action to help you just correct a bad habit or strengthen a skill. Thanks for watching. I'm Angela Fair. I'll be back tomorrow with a fresh video for World Watercolor Month. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with more watercolor advice you can learn from. Don't forget to include the hashtag World Watercolor Month when you participate and post watercolor art in July.